Tantor Audio presents The Longest Afternoon, the 400 Men Who Decided the Battle of Waterloo, by Brendan Sims. Narrated by Michael Page. When thou hast reached La Haye, survey it well. Here was the heat and centre of the strife. This point must Britain hold whate'er befell, and here both armies were profuse of life. Once it was lost, and then a stander by, belike had trembled for the victory. Robert Southey, The Poet's Pilgrimage to Waterloo, 1816. Preface. Despite the passage of 200 years and the 20th century effusions of bloodshed on a scale previously unimaginable, the Battle of Waterloo has lost none of its resonance. Countless towns, railway stations, and monuments across the world are testament to its enduring importance. The concept of meeting one's Waterloo has entered the English language, and was immortalized in the pop group ABBA's Eurovision winner Waterloo, thanks to which a generation of teenagers knew, even if it was all they knew, that at Waterloo Napoleon did surrender. Although the war did not end immediately, the battle was so conclusive that its name has become a byword for decisive victory. Waterloo, Victor Hugo wrote, was not a battle but a change in the direction of the world. Waterloo solved, as the historian Jeremy Black has argued, the Western question of whether Europe would be dominated by France or by a loose society of independent states, whose balance was guaranteed by Great Britain and her continental partners. This made the battle, as the British Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne recently suggested, half in jest and half as a swipe at his Labour predecessors, a great victory of coalition forces over a discredited former regime that had impoverished millions. Without the Prussian intervention in the battle, Ben Macintyre wrote in the Times, we'd all be speaking French. Contemporaries, too, were in no doubt about the significance of the struggle. Napoleon's flight from exile in Elba in February 1815 plunged Europe back into war. Of course, it is likely that, whatever the outcome at Waterloo, the Russians and Austrians would ultimately have brought Napoleon to heel again. But nobody could be sure of that, which was why all eyes were on the Allied army in Belgium. It is up to you to save the world, Tsar Alexander of Russia told its commander, the Duke of Wellington, before he set out. Shortly after the battle, the poet Byron wrote in Childe Harold of Waterloo as a place of skulls, where the United Nations prevailed over the French tyrant. This sense of United Nations was new. If Napoleon had once marshalled contingents from across the continent, so that at Leipzig in 1813 one could reasonably say that one half of Europe was battling the other, by Waterloo his force was almost entirely made up of Frenchmen. The Allied army, by contrast, was thoroughly multinational, with even the British making up only a plurality of Wellington's men at Waterloo. Byron's image of the United Nations triumphing over tyranny proved so powerful to Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt that they borrowed it for a new structure of world governance, which has remained with us to this day. This drama has been told often and told well. One crucial aspect of the battle, however, has been relatively neglected: the epic defence of the farm of Haye Sainte, at the centre of the Allied line, by the men of the Second Light Battalion, King's German Legion. Thanks to the availability of new sources, including unpublished material in the Hanoverian archives, we now know much more about these 400-odd riflemen. They were motivated by a combination of ideological opposition to Napoleonic tyranny, dynastic loyalty to the King of England, German patriotism, regimental camaraderie, personal bonds of friendship, and professional ethos. These men and their reinforcements held off Napoleon for long enough to change the course of the battle. This is their story. 1. Prelude. Belgium, early afternoon, Saturday, 17 June, 1815. The French have worsted Marshal Blücher's Prussians at Ligny and the Duke of Wellington's Allied army at the crossroads of Quatre Bras the day before. Now Napoleon is making haste to destroy Wellington's retreating army before he can unite with Blücher. Mercifully, the riflemen of the Second Light Battalion of the King's German Legion had missed the battle at Quatre Bras the day before, but they witnessed its appalling aftermath. A horrible field of corpses, literally swimming in blood, which at every step went over our ankles, in the words of Rifleman Friedrich Lindau. The general feeling, as Lieutenant Emanuel Biedermann recalled, was that Napoleon had caught the Allied army napping. Contrary to myth, however, none of the brigade officers were still in the clothes they had worn to the Duchess of Richmond's ball in Brussels a few days earlier. At around 2 p.m., the Second Light Battalion was detailed to relieve the skirmishers holding off the pursuing French and withdraw. Together with their fellow riflemen of the British 95th Regiment, they formed the rear guard for the entire Allied army. Starving and exhausted, the Germans rested in a meadow near Genappe. Despite the fact that they were told to prepare for a French attack, most of the men promptly fell asleep. They were soon woken, however, by a sudden thunderstorm and downpour. Then a detachment of Brunswick hussars galloped up and told them they must withdraw immediately, as the enemy was already encroaching on all sides. The Germans now retreated at the double through sunken roads, which the rain had turned into streams, and muddy cornfields, towards the military road which led to Brussels. Once past Genappe, where the water reached to their knees, the battalion was ordered to keep the highway free for the retreating Allied cavalry and artillery. The riflemen continued to march in the fields on either side of the road, through high corn and soil soft from the downpour. As they trudged northwards, the Germans pressed together more closely in order to minimize their exposure to the driving rain. Against the leaden skies and the thunder and lightning of the elements, the flash and crash of artillery continued to light up the horizon and reverberate across the fields. At regular intervals, Allied horsemen charged past them in order to drive off the encroaching French cavalry and skirmishers. By the end of the day, the riders were so soiled that the riflemen could no longer tell from their uniforms whether they were friend or foe. At times, the French advanced within a few hundred paces of the Germans. On more than one occasion, the battalion was forced to halt and deploy in square, the sides bristling with their distinctive sword bayonets in order to deter enemy cavalry. They would have been surprised to read Wellington's later dispatch to the effect that the enemy had not attempted to molest our march to the rear after Quatre Bras. The Germans were still better off than the unfortunate Belgian civilians who were attempting to escape the advancing French. Lieutenant Biedermann pitied the men who were driving their cattle before them, others bearing bundles, women carrying or pulling their children after them, all fleeing, moaning and weeping. It was about 7:30 in the evening of Saturday, 7 June, when the first riflemen reached the heights of Mont Saint-Jean, near the village of Waterloo. By the time the last legionnaires arrived, it was dark, though the night sky was occasionally illuminated by muzzle flashes, and the air was punctuated by gunfire and shouted orders, as the retreating columns were marshalled at the crossroads just beyond the substantial farmhouse of La Haye Sainte, which stood adjacent to the Brussels-Charleroi road, named, accounts differ, either after the crown of thorns worn by Christ at his crucifixion, or, more prosaically, after a brambled hedge which enclosed a nearby meadow. It was later still when the 400 or so Germans received word that they were to occupy the farm. The retreat was over. La Haye Sainte, the farm in which the Second Light Battalion was to fight its most celebrated action, consisted of a stable, a piggery, a barn, a substantial farmhouse, a low wall and a pond, arranged around a large courtyard. It was a common enough type of dwelling for the area. The farmer and his family had fled. The house was large, with walls in places more than a metre thick, and high ceilings. There were large dormer windows on the first story, and hay and straw in the floor above, which had no windows. A passage led through the stable to the fields on the western side. The main gate and a wicket gate gave access to the road to the east. A passage and 2 doors opened onto the kitchen garden immediately north of the house. Its northern and western sides were surrounded by a hedge, and the eastern side, which gave on to the road, by a wall. The garden contained a well and an outhouse. Just to the south of the main buildings was a large orchard, 3 sides of which were enclosed by another hedge, and the fourth by a large barn, about 30 metres long, and a low wall, through which a gate led into the courtyard. The buildings themselves were undamaged, but because La Haye Sainte lay just beside the main Allied line of withdrawal, it had already been plundered by passing soldiers. Most importantly, they had torn down the barn door opening onto the field to the left to provide firewood for some of the thousands of miserable men camped in the countryside around. Captain Jonathan Leach of the 95th Rifles, just across the road, describes sleeping on ground so boggy that it resembled a snipe marsh. Rifleman Simon Lehmann of the First Light Battalion, who spent the night in the sunken road behind the farm, must also have been extremely uncomfortable. Unfortunately for the Germans, most of the hay in the outbuildings was also carried away. The animals, however, were slaughtered, and the meat was shared with the neighbouring line battalion of the Legion. The riflemen overlooked the calf in the piggery, however. The men showed little interest in the food. For the moment, the main priority was to stay or to get dry. The lucky ones were able to take shelter within the buildings. Private Friedrich Lindau was one of those who drew the short straw. His company was sent to the orchard, where there was virtually no protection from the elements, and where they were so close to the enemy that the soldiers were forbidden to light a fire. Lindau did, however, succeed in making off with a pocketful of peas he found in the farmhouse. Most of the riflemen, though, had fallen into a stupor, their senses numbed by tiredness, hunger, and the incessant rain. Rather than lie in the damp, they leant against walls and trees, or sat on their knapsacks, staring vacantly into space. Even outside the main buildings, few tried to light a fire, admittedly no easy matter in the downpour, or to cook the fresh meat they had been issued. Instead, they warmed themselves with alcohol. The enterprising Lindau sneaked into the cellar and made off with a canteen of wine, which he shared with his comrades and with soldiers of the First Light Battalion stationed nearby. It was not long before Germans who had bivouacked further away, such as Corporal Meyer of the Bremen Field Battalion, came to scrounge some drink as well. Repeated return trips to the cellar ensured that the men in the orchard, and probably much of the rest of the garrison, were well supplied with alcohol. Eventually Lindau lay down for the night at the far end of the orchard, facing the enemy, his rifle at the ready. Lieutenant Emmanuel Biedermann, who was also trying to sleep among the trees, recalls that now quiet and a deep peace followed the racket of the day. On the other side of the valley, the pursuing French also settled in for the night. Many of them were Napoleonic veterans of many years' standing, others young recruits. Their personal loyalty to the Emperor was often fervent. 2 days before the battle, the advancing columns observed a young soldier, or rather a trunk of a man, who had 2 legs taken off by a cannon-ball, as well as severe face and chest wounds which had not yet healed. On seeing his comrades, the unfortunate lifted his hands and called out, "Long live the Emperor! I have lost my 2 legs, but I don't care. Victory is ours. Long live the Emperor!" Like their German counterparts, the French spent the afternoon and night of 17 June in the rain around spluttering campfires. The night was terrible, the French commander opposite La Haye Sainte recalls. Rain fell in abundance, which made the manoeuvring of artillery very difficult. The men had spent the night without shelter, and nobody had been able to make a fire. It was too wet to cook, so men like Corporal Conley of the 28th Line Regiment held on to the sheep they had captured nearby and the small square of butter he had picked up the day before. He and his comrades were part of Bourgeois's 2nd Brigade on Alix's 1st Division, one of 4 in d'Erlon's 1st Corps. Like the Germans in La Haye Sainte, d'Erlon's men had taken no part in the fighting at Quatre Bras, having wasted the day marching fruitlessly back and forth due to contradictory orders. After being reproached by Napoleon, as he recalled, in a very chagrined tone, d'Erlon was determined not to be found wanting again. As they bedded down for the night, the riflemen at La Haye Sainte knew that there would probably be a major engagement once the French main force arrived. Lieutenant Biedermann remembers seeing many of the men deep in thought that night. "I too wondered," he writes, "whether I would see my homeland and my dear ones again, or whether an enemy sword would propel me out of my unsettled life. At the threshold of death, the past and the future appear in a much more serious light than otherwise." Neither Biedermann, Lindau, nor the rest of the battalion, however, could have foreseen just how severely they would be tested the following day. 2. For King and Fatherland. The Germans of the Second Light Battalion had come a long way. They were not just in Haye Sainte because they were there. Their road to Waterloo began 12 years before, in 1803, when their Hanoverian homeland in northern Germany was overrun by Napoleon. Many had entered the new King's German Legion, KGL, established by their ruler George III of England, who was also Elector of Hanover, towards the end of that year. Others joined later to escape the rigours of the French occupation, travelling from Hamburg via Husum and Heligoland, or via Barth near Stralsund in Swedish Pomerania. The two rifle units, the 1st and the 2nd Light Battalions, were the very first to be established. Line artillery and cavalry formations followed later as more and more recruits arrived in Britain from the continent. The flow slowed to a trickle in 1809–10 as the occupation authorities clamped down, and in 1811–12 several Hanoverians were executed by the French for recruiting for the Legion. It was envisaged that many different nationalities would enlist in the Legion. In 1811 the British War Office laid down that the Legion should recruit none but such as are natives of Germany and speak, or at least understand, German, including all German countries which are now incorporated with France, likewise the possessions of the House of Austria and those which belonged formerly to Russia and Holland. The enlistment of French, Italians, Danes, Swedes, Russians, Spaniards, or Portuguese was explicitly ruled out. At Waterloo, the line battalions were the most mixed, with about 50% of the rank and file coming from German territories other than Hanover, especially Prussia, and, despite the War Office's injunctions, even Russia and Denmark. Generally speaking, the proportion of Hanoverians in the light battalions was higher, making them more homogeneous and very likely also more cohesive. All the same, about 1/3 of the men in Haye Sainte hailed from Prussia, Bavaria, and other parts of the old Holy Roman Empire, and there were even Poles, such as Alexander Dobritsky of the 3rd Company, and Flemings, such as Baptiste Charrier of the 5th Company. Wherever they came from, the men who enlisted in the 2nd Light Battalion had embarked on an odyssey leading from Hanover, via the Legion's English base camp at Bexhill on the Channel coast, expeditions to northern Germany and garrison duty in Ireland in 1805–6, to the Baltic in 1807–8, the Iberian Peninsula in 1808–9, to the Scheldt in 1809, back to the Peninsula in 1811–13, through southern France and the shadow of demobilization after Napoleon's exile to Elba, to the slopes of Mont Saint-Jean in Belgium. Unlike most of the foreign formations which fought in the coalitions against Napoleon, the King's German Legion was part of the British regular army. For those not already in royal service, commissions were temporary until August 1810, and were then made permanent by Act of Parliament in recognition of the Legion's services in the Peninsula. Some of its officers were British, especially in the 2nd Light Battalion, as were the paymasters. Its bankers were the London firm of Greenwood, Cox and Company in Craig's Court off Whitehall, eventually absorbed into Lloyd's Bank. The language of command was generally English, as was the rank structure. The men of the 2nd Light Battalion were equipped with standard-issue Baker rifles, and they wore the same distinctive green jackets as the British riflemen. If they enlisted in Britain, recruits were paid the same bounty as the King's other subjects. They swore the same oath, and were, as the official proclamation put it, generally subject to the same regulations and articles of war as His Majesty's British troops. The Legion adopted the English enthusiasm for physical exercise, such as rowing, wrestling, stick fencing and boxing, and team sports such as football and cricket. The officers could avail themselves of a progressive military education, and were allowed to attend artillery courses in arithmetic, drawing, geometry, geography, and fortifications. The Germans never served as a single corps, but were always brigaded with other British units on operations, though at Waterloo their divisional commander, Sir Charles von Alten, was a Hanoverian. By Waterloo the Legion had more than a decade of combat experience fighting alongside the rest of Wellington's army. Of a total of some 30,000 legionnaires who served throughout the conflict, about 1,300 were killed in action, with nearly 5,900 dying from all causes. The two light battalions were unusual within the Legion in that they never completely adopted British drill regulations or the English language. German remained in use throughout the Second Light Battalion, but English was prescribed for sentry duty, where it was vital to avoid misunderstandings, and on parade. Majors and adjutants were chosen with their knowledge of English in mind. Many of the officers were already fluent. Those who were not took private lessons, often with female tutors, in which they made great strides. Some officers who had begun their diaries in German completed them in English. They often switched between the two languages in conversation and correspondence. For example, a table on losses and additions to the fighting strength has entries under joined and total effectives, as well as gestorben, died, and verabschiedet ohne Pension, discharged without a pension. Some senior officers, such as General von Alten, who commanded the Light Division in Spain, and Sir Julius von Hartmann, reinvented themselves as hybrid Anglo-German gentlemen, affecting the manners and dress of their hosts. It was also common for the rank and file to adopt, or to be given, English first names. One list has a John Hennes, a Frederick Almutz, and a Henry Ebeling, as well as the more German Wilhelm Witz. So by Waterloo, even the German Second Light Battalion of the King's German Legion had effectively become bilingual. We would nowadays describe it as an agent of cultural transfer. The 18th century forebears of the Hanoverians, the auxiliary regiments deployed in England during the French invasion scares of the 7 Years' War, had been despised as agents of royal despotism. These sentiments had attenuated but by no means evaporated by the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period. The radical William Cobbett was imprisoned as late as 1810 in the aftermath of his diatribes against the King's German Legion. For this reason, the King's German Legion was regarded with some trepidation when it marched to its depot at Bexhill on the south coast of England, camping on the village commons en route. When two officers passed a couple of farmers on the way to the pub, they overheard the following conversation. "Where are you going, Jack?" one asked. "We are going to the common to see the wild Germans," the other answered. Upon their return to the camp they found the men eating, observed by astonished locals. "Look at them," the locals cried. "They have spoons, knives, and forks like ourselves." Soon, however, the Legion was accepted at all levels of English society. Their strong musical traditions in particular made an impression on the population. Many of the officers and rank and file married local girls. One of them was Captain Philip Holzermann of the 1st Light Battalion, later posted just beside La Haye Sainte, who wed Marianne Pumphrey, daughter of the customs officer at Bexhill in 1812. Others were Rifleman Henry Bush, or Bush, B-U-S-C-H, as he was baptized, of the 2nd Light Battalion, who married Harriet Hazelden in September 1810, and Rifleman George Gottfried Heinz, also of the 2nd Light Battalion, who married local girl Marianne Burt in January 1813. Even today, the streetscape of Bexhill-on-Sea, as it is now called, records the connection. The barracks and the Germans are long gone, but there is still a Barrack Road, a Hanover Close nearby, and a Hanover House on the old High Street. The Legion had a distinctive ethos. Relations between officers and men were closer than in most British formations. The general tone in the memoir literature is respectful and affectionate on both sides. This also seems to have applied to officers of British origin, perhaps because they tended to be men from less smart backgrounds who could not afford or obtain a commission in one of the more prestigious English or Scottish regiments. Indeed, the Legion was unusual in that commissions could not be bought. Moreover, many men of the King's German Legion, far from being mere continental mercenaries in the King's pay, perceived themselves as ideological warriors against Napoleon and French domination generally. They pointedly refused to join the French-sponsored Hanoverian Legion, which would have been a much more convenient choice of career. The 2nd Light Battalion certainly expressed none of the grudging admiration for Boney which one often found in British ranks, or the ideological sympathies for the Napoleonic project frequently expressed by other Germans, for example in the Rhineland. Likewise, the rank and file perceived themselves not as the scum of the earth, for whom military service was simply an escape from poverty or incarceration, nor simply as honest military professionals for whom service was a lifelong occupation, but as free Germans and loyal subjects of the Elector King, who who had volunteered to rid their land of the French scourge. In this they resembled the Free French of General de Gaulle during the Second World War. Thus Julius von Hartmann refused to collaborate with the French and condemned the fearfulness and lack of character of those who did so. Friedrich Heinecker, who recruited for the Legion in North Germany, spoke of the patriotic sentiment of the men, their mighty bitterness against the hereditary enemy, and their determination to fight against Napoleon and to cast off the yoke of French tyranny. One surgeon of the Legion wrote of leaving his native town of Minden in order to breathe more freely in free England, and to provide myself with a future while my prospects at home were obscured by a sinister veil. Such sentiments were shared by ordinary soldiers such as Rifleman Friedrich Lindau of the Second Light Battalion, who spoke of his implacable resentment against France and the French. This patriotism applied not only to the Hanoverians, but to the other Germans as well. Even the Swiss Emanuel Biedermann, a lieutenant in the Second Light Battalion, spoke of his desire to drive out the French who had no respect for any international law, and looked forward to we Germans and Swiss having an active role in the wars of liberation on the soil of the fatherland. These feelings chimed with those of the Legion's British officers. Whatever his private reservations against these heavy, selfish Germans, Lieutenant Edmund Wheatley of the 5th Line Battalion noted that they were all at Waterloo to deal out thunder and confusion to the opposers of the English Constitution. The King's German Legion, in short, was an Anglo-German hybrid designed to tap into the human resources of the old Holy Roman Empire in order to expel the French and to restore German liberty and the European balance of power. The Legionnaires were a socially diverse group, even among the officers. Georg Hartog Gerson, who joined the Legion as a hospital assistant, came from a long line of Jewish doctors in Altona near Hamburg. His grandfather had been in charge of the Jewish hospital there, and his father and elder brothers were medical doctors as well. He studied at Berlin and the Hanoverian University of Göttingen, securing a medical doctorate in April 1810. A year later, not long after entering the Legion, Gerson was commissioned as assistant surgeon to the 5th Line Battalion of the King's German Legion. He served in the Peninsula and southern France. In June 1815, his regiment formed part of the 2nd King's German Legion Infantry Brigade, commanded by the legendary Christian von Ompteda. Indeed, the Omptedas epitomized the Hanoverian struggle against Napoleon. Christian Friedrich von Ompteda was a major in the Hanoverian Guards Regiment when his country was overrun by the French in 1803. He joined the Legion as soon as it was formed and served in northern Germany and against the Danes in 1807, enduring a brief period of captivity after being shipwrecked off the Dutch coast. Taking command of the 1st Light Battalion in October 1812, Ompteda fought with distinction in the Peninsula and southern France. Despite a tendency towards excitability and nervous disorder, which periodically forced him to take extraordinary leave, he became commander of the 2nd King's German Legion Brigade. His younger brother, Ludwig Karl Georg von Ompteda, served as a Hanoverian envoy, tirelessly fighting Napoleon on the diplomatic front. During the Waterloo campaign he was ambassador to Prussia, whose forces were hastening to Wellington's aid in Belgium. The wars against Napoleon had already claimed a heavy price from the family. Their cousin, Captain Ferdinand von Ompteda, fell ill on active service and died in October 1809 at Egham near Windsor. Another cousin, Captain August von Ompteda, was killed in action at Elvas, Portugal, in April 1811. Just before setting out on the Waterloo campaign, Christian learned that his much-loved third brother, Ferdinand, a fellow officer in the Legion, had died after a short illness. "My dear Ludwig," he wrote to his surviving brother, "the three-cornered clover leaf, the family emblem, held for half a century." Christian recalled Ferdinand's quiet sensibility and Ludwig's skilful handling of differences arising from fate and my own unstable temperament, which had sustained the brothers through thick and thin. Now that Ferdinand was lost, he enjoined Ludwig that they should tie their bonds closer and tighter than ever, and not allow the autumn of their lives to rob the leaves of their family symbol of its living freshness. The sight of the three-sided clover, Christian felt, would be a constant reminder of our loss. In practical terms, he was anxious about the future of his dead brother's sons, the two eldest of whom were serving for the interim with the 5th Line Battalion. Christian believed that they were...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?